Hey guys, this is Tyler here, and I'm doing discuss with everyone here a quick topic. And what the topic is the major difference I see with uh, both incels and MGTOW guys here in Europe compared to say in U.S., Canada, we'll say North America. And I'm just going to run through this here so people can kind of get an idea of my perspective and the difference. Okay, so many people may here know I've been living in Eastern Europe for a couple years. I also lived in South America, and for this sake, I'm when I say Eastern Europe, this could be anywhere on the eastern board. So I know that technically Estonia is northeastern Europe, but I'm just using it for simplify it here. So this is both Estonia and Russia. I've lived in both these two countries, and obviously I've also lived in the U.S. and South America, Chile and Argentina, and I notice major differences amongst these groups when I look at like MGTOW and Incel, whether it's in South America, Europe, and in North America. And so what I notice here, firstly, is that in South America it's much more underground. There's not a lot of guys that would publicly identify with this category. If you go down to like Argentina or even Brazil, most guys, they wouldn't publicly tell you. You would have to know those guys pretty well before they would be comfortable telling you such a thing. In fact, when I was living down in South America, I never once met a person in a face-to-face environment that told me that they identified like this. I suspect there was a good friend of mine, his cousin in southern Chile, when I went to visit his family. I think perhaps this guy was. But that was the only guy, honestly, that I would have suspected. But no one ever once told me. When I was living in Argentina, it was the same way. In Argentina, for the size of the country, it's very tiny. This group, and I've mentioned this before. I don't see it growing a lot, honestly, in Argentina because the culture is very strong. It's very deep in the people, and there's just certain fundamental tendencies that Argentines have, and even if they're dirt poor, they're not going to go without. And dating is one of those things in most cases. Good food also, and wine. But that's what I saw when I was down there. Now, when I look at like living here in Eastern Europe, when I compare these MGTOW guys like in Eastern Europe, it's also not very public. I also notice so it's not as the guys don't tend to be as pissed off, we might say, about being part of this philosophy and living this way. This for most guys, they accept it. I think here in Europe, as a whole, and definitely in Eastern Europe, it's not as much of the incel category. Now, when I look over to like U.S. and Canada, I think it tends to be more incel, which obviously is involuntary. These are guys that initially don't have any choice and they have to go this way. But I also notice I think it's a little more aggressive. There's definitely more of an undertone that guys mean business, especially incel guys over in North America. It's not as much like that here in Europe, and I suspect there's some major reasons. One of the first thing, and also in Canada, because Canada also very powerful within MGTOW and incel. And if we look at like Elliot Rogers, for example, I was watching a documentary on him. This famous guy Manassian, who was the Canadian shooter back 4 years ago, was actually very inspired by Rogers, and they actually had corresponded. They knew each other, and they were very familiar with each other. Very similar philosophy there, and so. But these guys, they obviously, this is the most aggressive element of incels. Even for the incel guys, this is very small category of guys in some respect, when I watch like the guy Manasseh, I was watching his interview today, it very much reminded me of like kind of these Al Qaeda or Taliban band fighters in the Middle East, like in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, this is the impression that I get, almost like some holy warrior, basically. One of these dudes. So, I mean, if you watch the guy, that I mean, he doesn't really seem sad. It like seemed very proud, like it was a victory for him, honestly, in the whole Incel army, the whole Incel team. Okay, but when I look at North America, U.S., Canada, for MGTOW and Incel, one of the biggest differences to say here in Europe is the fact that when you look at the continent of Europe, guys can very easily move from one place to the next. And anyone who's ever lived in Europe knows there's huge differences. You can go, once you leave the European Union, for example, you go from Estonia to Russia, different world, honestly. It's completely different. Like, I tell guys, if they have problems staying here in Estonia, go over to Russia. It'll be completely different. You could go over to Belarus, same thing, non-EU, very similar, parallel to Russia. Serbia also would be another option. There's also other EU countries you could check out. Not all of them are bad options. But the main point here is that there's a lot of variation from north, south, east, west. In the case of Europe, these countries are not all part of the same federation like we see in the US. Like in the US, unfortunately, you don't have that same luxury. I mean, I used to live up in Minnesota. I was very close to the Canadian border, like 4.5 hours. If I wanted to leave the country, I could drive to Canada, but it would be as bad in Canada, if not worse in Canada. So I would have to go to the whole other side of the country, to Mexico, perhaps. And it's not close. But at the same time, Mexico, it shares a lot of similarities to North America as a whole. I mean, the Mexican senoritas, there's some nice ladies down there. I won't lie about that. But if you're wanting something that's not so Western, you're going to have to go a lot further away. That's kind of the point here. If you're in Europe, on the other hand, you're not that far. You don't have to travel that far. If you're like wanting some action, I mean, I could leave, like, I mean, I'm like a few hours from the Russian border. I'm not far from the Belarusian border, and these are all options. So I think in the mindset of these guys, like MGTOW guys, for example, here in Europe, they know this. They know that irrespective, obviously a lot of MGTOW guys don't care anyhow. They're not simply going to travel for bedroom action in this sense, but they do know in the back of the mind they don't have to travel that far. An Estonian guy does not have to go that far. A German guy that isn't that far from Belarus. Very different country. German guy goes to Belarus and their SMB literally goes up 4 or 5 notches. It's just insane. And this is one of the biggest luxuries of being in Europe. It's unfortunate, I will admit, that Europe in the past 20 to 30 years has really, some of the countries have homogenized too much, in my opinion, but it's still pretty good. When you look at the whole picture, though, and we can look at the fact that, like, England, of course, just had their Brexit. They're not part of the European Union, and they're kind of separate also now. And I could also see some other countries in their near future leaving the EU, and that would also have kind of an impact on the social dynamic. These are all factors that guys are working with here. So we go over to the US and Canada, say a Canadian guy. For a Canadian guy, they could go to the US, but it's not that much different. It's going to be pretty similar. And so if a guy's from Vancouver, from Toronto, if they want something a lot different, like guys from the US, like myself, they're going to have to hop into a plane and fly across the world. That's the only way. And guys know this. And this is, I think, fundamentally, this really plays into the perspective of guys in this situation. It also subconsciously gives guys a ray of hope say European guys, they know that they have options. They can go elsewhere, and they're not far away. And this is probably one of the things that makes guys less likely to want to commit crazy acts. It also, another thing here is that I've spoken about this before. Many of the European countries are more homogenous. They are not nearly, you don't hear this expression, diversity is our strength. This you will never hear this in at least half the European countries, never. And this is not the mindset. Yes, do you see other groups? Of course, I have a good friend here who's from Nigeria. He's been studying and working in Estonia. He eventually probably will leave, but there's not a lot of foreign people here. And this is one of the other things I think that people kind of see it as their own compatriots or their own, kind of like their cousins in a sense, when they see like fellow guys with girlfriends, with wives. People kind of see them as with one within their own community. Whereas obviously, like in the U.S., for example, something I noticed, not so much with MGTOW, but I noticed with incel guys, is that they really get angry and disturbed, especially when they see like these kind of cross-cultural, multiracial relationships, marriages. There seems to be a lot of friction when I listen to like videos from Rogers or Manassian. This is something they mentioned. And it's also ironic by the fact that Elliot Rogers' mom actually was Chinese or of some Asian descent. And I know Manassian, I believe his parents actually immigrated from Armenia to Canada, which is kind of Middle Eastern in a sense. So very interesting. You would think that they would be kind of more, maybe more embracing. And I believe in both their cases. I know in Elliot Rogers' case, he had a strong preference for white females. And I would assume it was probably the same thing with Manassian, by what he has said. So this is something that really plays into the minds of guys. Guys that live like in Europe, there's not those triggers most likely. In most countries, those triggers don't exist, unlike in what we see in North America. And that probably kind of stirs up a little stronger emotions in them because these are more homogenous countries. So people just don't naturally probably feel as bad because culturally speaking, people are coming from more similar background. You look at a country like Estonia, the real homogenous countries, or go to Norway, Sweden, people that are ethnically Norwegian, Swedish. My dad, for example, in that situation, in that category, it's very similar. I mean, when we look at like Norwegians and Swedes, ethnic Norwegians and Swedes, almost like it would almost be comparable to like cousins in other countries. Most of the people share very similar root ancestors, basically, and that's so. I think that's kind of a creates more of a village effect and just different mindset there. Also, too, like more concentration of radicalized ideals, we might say, in America, in Canada. You see this very large contrast in opinions and stuff, and that's and people also that are willing to be more public about these opinions. That's another big thing. I don't think guys, like, if they do have as strong of feelings like in some European countries, they're probably not going to be as strong about them. It's similar to what I mentioned in South America, like Chile, Argentina, Ecuador. Any of these countries, guy falls into this category. Maybe if you're a good friend with them, they may tell you. But like, if you know anything about, like, if you've lived in South America, like most of these family members of guys, if they felt this way, would probably not agree with their ideals, especially their moms or any women in their family. Guys here who are watching from South America can probably relate to this. Maybe certain ones would, but many wouldn't like the ideals that much, the whole philosophy. They would have a very different idea on life and stuff. So this is kind of where I think it's generally speaking, in South America, it's very peaceful in this sense. And I think most guys, like in South America that I've spoken to who are MGTOW, tend to be all right with this, and they're fine with it usually. They don't, it's totally out of their own choosing. Most of the guys are 100% in this. Unlike maybe guys I've met in the States or in Europe, there's probably not as much confidence in this, we might say. Also, when we look at how the US, Canada, how the whole country is set up, unfortunately, how these systems are designed is that there's, I think, so much emptiness in certain respects, or maybe guys feel this way. There's lack of culture often, and when you compare it to some European countries, Asian, and that also, I think, really weighs on a guy, especially if they don't have any other siblings or they're not close to their parents or anyone. They have a very empty feeling in this sense, and that would be more the incel guys here, more so than MGTOW. But so these more radicalized incel guys can kind of take that frustration out because they don't really have a lot of culture to experience. And I just think of this like guy Manassian. If he had been like born and raised in Armenia, how different his perspective on life would be, how different his whole everything for him would be. And I for one thing, he would have found a girlfriend or found a wife in Armenia, but at the same time, economics may have been a lot more challenging there. Maybe not, though. It's really hard to say. I mean, we're seeing right now a reverse. A lot of people of like white European descent in America, US and Canada, are now basically they're going back to Europe. It's like 2, 3, 4 generations. They're going back to Europe essentially. It's unbelievable. I think people's grandparents or great grandparents, like in my case, that had immigrated to the U.S. would have never imagined that they would then be coming back to Europe. South America also kind of the same thing. You see people in Argentina with like Brazil or with Italian, Portuguese, French passports also doing the same. I know a couple friends of my brothers who actually have European passports, and they actually also just moved to Europe. They found that was a better situation. It's interesting times that we live in. But like I said, with Manassian, he had probably this culture void, and that played into it. One of the things, though, that I also noticed with the incel guys, one of the big differences is that it's quite obvious. Many of these guys are virgins, if not all of them. And that's one of the things that would be interesting to look at, if these guys would feel differently if they had slept with a few gals, if that they would still have these same kind of like feelings. Because I mean, guys who've kind of had at least 1 or 2 girlfriends would know, would probably have a maybe different idea of this. Perhaps not, though. I do think, though, that probably played a big role in that them being kind of frustrated by that role. Because MGTOW guys, for example, it's very common the older ones came from long relationships, marriages, and have had some experiences. So they kind of see everything quite differently. Another thing also is that I do believe, not in all European countries, but I kind of mentioned before, European guy from one country can often go to a different country. It may not be that far away, and find a gal to go out with. They can probably hop onto a dating app, and this is the key here, is that these dating apps are one of a few major outlets that guy can use in Europe. No matter what country they come from, there's probably some other European country they can travel to and have some options. Whereas like in the US, as we know, these dating apps are just useless. They're absolutely worthless. I mean, at least in some like Belarus and Russia, Ukraine. I mean, you could still get something, or at the very least, you could just go out onto the street if you were that willing to, and perhaps try to meet some gals. But guys, on the other hand, in North America, it's really often they don't really have a choice. And another thing also, this whole mindset of harassment. This is a huge difference here in Europe compared to in North America on a whole, apart from like England, because like we all know how these like harassment laws and guys just they feel like they're walking on eggshells. It can be in school, it could work, any social setting, and they could be accused of something, actually get arrested and go to jail. This in most of European countries generally won't happen. A guy's not going to be accused of something and then go to jail even if they weren't doing it. This just really, rarely happens if it's not legitimate. And this is a big thing that guys have to be constantly preoccupied with. Are they going to be accused of harassment? Are they going to be accused of this? It's such a big deal because this can destroy your life. I know people personally, it has destroyed their life, or they've gone to courts and had to spend tens, if not a couple $100,000 fighting these cases, and perhaps going to prison. This kind of thing is not common in most of Europe, and this is huge difference here. So for safety purposes, it makes sense. It's not that you're going up against a person, and I tell this to people, it's just like in divorce court system, in child support and alimony, you're going up